A fresh round of diplomatic dispute erupts at the UN Security Council last Friday, following North Korea's second failed satellite launch and Japan's release of Fukushima radioactive wastewater into the Pacific Ocean. So how are China and Russia defending North Korea's latest display of defiance? And what has been the response from South Korea and its allies, including the US and Japan? Meanwhile, what has been the response to Japan's release of Fukushima radioactive wastewater? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. We start the work week today with our panel of foreign journalists and their take on events here in this part of the world that are making headlines elsewhere as well. For more, I have Jacco Zwetsloot here in the studio. Jacco, welcome back.
Hello, thank you for having me.
I also have Anthony Kuhn joining us live from neighboring Japan. Anthony, it's great to have you with us.
Nice to join you, thanks.
Right, Jacco, let's begin here in the studio then. Let's start off with some details about North Korea's most recent satellite attempt, which ended in failure as well, and this was acknowledged by the regime itself. Do tell us more.
Yes, after the first attempt by North Korea to launch a missile failed back on May 31st, this was the second trial. Now, according to the state-run media out of North Korea, the first and second stages of this latest rocket operated normally, but the launch failed, quote, due to an error in the emergency blasting system during the third stage flight. Now, North Korea's National Aerospace Development Administration, or NADA, said that it will find the reason why and it will prepare for a third launch in October. Now, according to my NK News colleague Collins Werko, experts have interpreted the North statement to mean that there was an accidental activation of the self-destruct system in the third stage, and that's what made it go down. Now, last year, during a visit to NADA's Satellite Control Center in Pyongyang, Kim Jong-un said, quote, "It is the strategic and tactical policy of the Korean Workers' Party to strictly watch and distinguish the hostile military actions against the DPRK committed by the US imperialist aggression and its followers in and around the Korean Peninsula." So I believe that North Korea has shown that it's determined and it will spare no resources to put at least one military reconnaissance satellite, and maybe even a network of them, into orbit around the Earth.
Right, and staying with that, Jacco, this failed satellite mission, it led, that is, to yet another standoff between South Korea as well as its allies, including the US, and North Korea, as well as its neighbors, namely China and Russia, at the UN Security Council last week. First of all, what is the stance shared by North Korea, China, and Russia?
Well, before I get into that, I have to say, so there was this meeting called at the Security Council by the United States and Japan, France, Ecuador, Albania, and Malta. These other countries are all currently members of the Security Council. And this meeting was held to condemn North Korea's launch, saying that it violated UN Security Council resolutions against North Korea's use of ballistic missile technology, which is used in both rocket launches and in launching satellites. So put simply, the shared position of North Korea and China and Russia is that North Korea has a right to use that technology, although they each express it in different ways. North Korea had its ambassador attend the UN Security Council meeting. That's Ambassador Kim Song, and that was the first time that a North Korean ambassador turned up to such a meeting since 2017, so it's been quite a while. And he said that that North Korea has an independent and legitimate right as a sovereign country to launch a satellite for, quote, self-defense to deter the ever-increasing hostile military acts of the United States and its followers. And he also said that North Korea has never recognized any Security Council resolutions against it, and he claims that they infringe upon the rights of a sovereign state, and North Korea will never be bound by them in the future. Meanwhile, Russia's ambassador to the UN, he called the Security Council meeting a cynical, hypocritical attempt by the US and its allies to step up pressure on Pyongyang and to detract attention from the reckless escalatory actions of Washington and its allies in the region. And lastly, China's deputy ambassador to the UN accused the United States of, quote, a long-standing hostile policy towards the DPRK, and he blamed US military pressure for North Korea feeling increasingly insecure. So that's the sort of united stance of North Korea, Russia, and China.
And that being said, how are authorities over in the US, as well as here in South Korea, responding to these rampant accusations of hostility?
Yes, the US ambassador to the United Nations, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, said that 13 out of the 15 members of the United Nations Security Council are united in their opposition to North Korea's actions in which they called unlawful. She also rejected Russia and China's claims that the US is acting in a hostile manner. She described the current Ulchi Freedom Shield exercises that are taking place here in South Korea as routine, lawful and defensive. And most importantly, these are things that are not banned by United Nations Security Council resolutions, unlike rocket launches by North Korea. She also restated that President Biden and his administration want to have dialogue with North Korea, not confrontation. But China mocked that, saying that, or asking how dialogue can resume while there are large-scale military exercises underway in South Korea. Now, South Korea is not currently in the Security Council at the UN, so it didn't say anything at that meeting, but in other statements it has echoed what US Ambassador Thomas Greenfield said, that the launch is a breach of UN Security Council resolutions and that North Korea should stop them.
Right. Anthony, you are currently in Japan. What has been the response there to North Korea's persistent acts of provocation?
Well, as you know, North Korea is often near the flight paths of North Korean missiles. Japan is also within range of North Korean missiles. I remember checking into a hotel earlier this year, and I was surprised to see a note on the desk informing guests that the national alarm system could go off at any time in case of an approaching North Korean missile. And it asked for the guests' understanding for any quote-unquote discomfort. You also know that North Korea's threat is a very important factor in Japan overhauling its national security policy and making changes not seen in the post-war era, most notably acquiring offensive capabilities, including cruise missiles that could hit North Korea, beefing up its missile defenses, sharing intelligence with the US and South Korea. Arguably, China is a threat that concerns it more, but North Korea is also very much an important factor. We should also note, I think, that Japan's Prime Minister Fumio Kishida has taken a slightly different tack in that he has said he is willing to meet face-to-face with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. But there, he's mostly interested in resolving the issue of North Korean detainees. Now, North Korea looked into the matter, reported back in 2016 that there are no abductees in Japan, and therefore the issue is closed. So it's sort of hard to see how Japan is going to make progress on the diplomatic front with that as its focus.
Right, I see. Meanwhile, Anthony, last week's UN Security Council meeting also witnessed a very bitter confrontation between Japan and North Korea, as well as China, of course, over the former's release of Fukushima radioactive wastewater into the Pacific Ocean that began last week as well. What more can you tell us about that?
Yes, well, it appears to be quite a five-way tussle there at the UNSC. Now, one thing that North Korea's foreign ministry asked for last week was for Japan to cancel the release of the wastewater. Now, that's not too extraordinary given the fact that Japanese are asking for the exact same thing. Locals in Fukushima, fishermen, are suing the government to get it to stop the release. However, some other rhetoric from North Korea and China appear to be somewhat more over the top. They say essentially that this wastewater dump is, threatening all of mankind and all of the oceans. It's hard to see how it could apply to all of the oceans in the world. And comments like that certainly could be interpreted to mean that they are using this as a card, that the issue is being politicized and used against Japan.
Anthony, North Korea has accused Japan of committing a heinous crime against humanity. Japan, for its part, has dismissed the accusation, claiming that science says its release of Fukushima wastewater, radioactive wastewater, is safe. Now, you've mentioned that the fishermen there in Japan are also quite concerned. What is the response from the broader Japanese public with regard to the release of this wastewater?
Well, the relationship between the standoff with other countries and the situation within their own countries is, I think, as you would find it in other places. And that is to say, you may be furious as your own government for what they're doing, But when outsiders attack you, you tend to circle the wagons and become rather defensive and even patriotic. And that's certainly the case in Japan. I think people feel that they've been treated unfairly and that other countries have nuclear waters that are dumping water into the oceans as well. So why are they being picked on? Now, some of the polls here in Japan suggest that Japanese really are not sure whether to oppose or to support the poll. They see what the scientists say, but they certainly are not going to go measuring tritium levels in water or seafood. So they may believe the science, but at the same time, they may hedge their bets by asking by not offering sashimi to their children or grandchildren. I was in Fukushima last week. I spoke to the fishermen there who feel very much betrayed by the government, which went ahead with its release of the water without their opinion. And they feel that people in the northeast region known as Tohoku are essentially looked down upon, seen as a source of cheap labor, cheap seafood, and cheap electric energy by the people of Tokyo. So it's a very complicated tricky issue about regions in Japan.
Right. Meanwhile, Jacco, here in South Korea this past weekend, there was a large public protest demanding tangible action by the government here in response to Tokyo's Fukushima wastewater release. Could you tell us a bit more about this particular protest? And do you believe that this issue itself may perhaps hinder trilateral security efforts among South Korea, Japan, and the US?
Yeah, according to protest organizers, there were about 50,000 protesters last Saturday, but according to the police, that figure was more like 7,000, so we've got quite a range there. They rallied near City Hall and Gwanghwamun intersections in downtown Seoul before marching to Yongsan, where the presidential office is now located. And there were lots of placards, signs and banners, mostly in Korean, but also a few in English and in Japanese, calling on the plan to release the wastewater from Fukushima to be scrapped. Also on Saturday, a group of about 16 university students tried to invade the Japanese embassy, which is currently located in an office building near Gyeongbokgung Station. But they were dragged and carried out of that building by police and held for a short time before being released. The demonstrators used this protest as a plan to criticize both Japan and the government of President Yoon Suk-yeol here in South Korea. There was some intemperate language used, such as that by Lee Jae-myung, opposition leader, who said that Japan had declared war against nations bordering the Pacific Ocean, and calling on Japan to apologize to Korea for this act. Another protest is planned next week, and I imagine they'll go on for some time. As to whether this will affect trilateral security efforts between South Korea, Japan and the United States, I don't think so. I think after the Camp David meeting, we see that the three leaders are broadly on the same page, and that security cooperation, they see that, and as well as supply chain cooperation, as the bigger issues and more urgent issues that must be focused on.
Right. Anthony, China, in response, of course, has declared an all-out ban on imports of Japanese aquatic products. Now, media reports here in South Korea claim that Japan was taken aback by this abrupt action by China, especially keeping in mind that the latter accounts for a significant portion of Japan's seafood exports. How accurate, Anthony, are these reports?
Well, the quotes about Japanese officials being taken aback by the Chinese response were anonymous, and it's very hard to verify. But I think that observers and officials in Japan should not have been taken back, in the sense that they know that relations between the two governments are so frosty at the moment that the two countries' leaders cannot meet. And if they can't meet, then it's very hard for them to put a floor under the relationship to keep relations from spiraling downward, which both sides really want to do, partly for economic reasons. Also, you might think that government-to-government relations might not intrude on the issue of seafood imports or exports, but we know that all sorts of issues such as tourism or cultural imports can be harnessed in the service of economic statecraft, to put it nicely, or economic coercion. Also, this goes beyond government relations, of course. Japan has been urging its citizens who live in China to keep a low profile and not attract attention. There have been reports at rocks or eggs being thrown at Japanese schools in China. This doesn't go as far as the anti-Japanese protests of 2012, which were over the anti-Japan protests in China of 2012, which had to do with the dispute over the Diaoyu or Senkaku Islands. But I think people in Japan are very much aware of this undercurrent of anti-Japanese nationalism, and they should know that it's very easy to inflame or set off by any sort of incident.
Right, of course. Meanwhile, Jacco, back on regional security concerns, South Korea held its first civil defense drill in 6 years, that is, last Wednesday. But the greater public failed to partake in this particular exercise, raising fresh concerns about how prepared the public would be in the event of a North Korean attack. What more can you share with us?
Yeah, there is a lot of complacency, ignorance and confusion here in Seoul about those defense drills. I can speak from personal experience. I live in a large mixed-use building in the middle of downtown Seoul, and when I asked my building supervisor, so the management office, where the nearest shelter was, and I asked them on the morning of the day of the drill, they looked at me and each other in confusion because none of them knew, none of them had thought to ask, and none of them were planning to go anywhere at 2 p.m. When the alarm sounded. Now later I went to an office building next door, which is marked on Kakao maps as a shelter, a civil defense shelter, and I was told by the security guard at the front desk that that shelter was only for people who worked in that building and that they weren't letting in any outsiders, so it wasn't for the general public. So I actually don't know where I was supposed to go on that day, so I went to an office instead where I have some colleagues and just stayed with them. But yeah, people in Seoul have grown very complacent in the years since the shelling of Yeonpyeong Island in 2010. Barely anybody bothered to seek shelter at all last week. Some people kept working while others kept going about their business or continued drinking their afternoon coffee. And as someone who observes the lives of Seoul citizens, but also someone who lives in Seoul, I am concerned about the lack of public preparedness. When they do drills in, for example, places like Israel, they are taken much more seriously. So the government may have to try harder to get people to participate next time. The challenge is, in a liberal democracy, rather than a military-run dictatorship, as South Korea was from the 60s to the 1980s, how can you achieve that? How can you push people to do something that they don't necessarily want to do or don't see the need for? So that is a challenge that the government in Korea will have to deal with.
Right, and I suppose the public should make a greater effort, that is, to find out where the nearest shelter is, of course. And keeping in mind what Jacco has just said, Anthony, do you believe the South Korean public has perhaps become inert to North Korea's threats of violence? And if so, how do you explain it?
Well, being a resident of Seoul, I take it very seriously, too. I checked the map to see where the nearest shelter was. And, you know, I, as a resident of Seoul, I think in general, if you live near a persistent threat, of course you become inured to it. There's not a lot you can do about it, except, you know, be aware and be prepared. But I think it's also clear that the degree of sense of threat, the degree of sense of security changes a lot. And I think it's very clear that we are at a point where, you know, people are quite nervous. After, you know, during 2018 and 2019, when North Korea had a sort of de facto moratorium in place on ICBM and nuclear testing, and there was diplomacy going on and a sense of hope about where things were going, the sense of threat was much lower. The threat is much, I think the sense of threat is higher now than it's been in a long time. And I saw a Asan Institute think tank poll from earlier this year, which said that in 2016, the number of people who felt negative about national security were at about 60%. Now it's about 70%. So I think you can feel the change.
Right, and keeping this change in mind, Jacco, I understand this will be a tough question, but speaking as a member of the media who has been in Korea for the past 20 years or more, of course, do you believe the Korean Peninsula at this particular moment is perhaps closer to a warfare?
No, I don't see any signs of that. North Korea is currently occupied with, as we've talked about earlier, getting its satellite up into orbit, and also with processing the North Korean citizens who are returning to their country for the first time in 3.5 years since the COVID pandemic started. So they're busy with that. Russia is busy fighting its war on Ukraine. China is experiencing an economic slowdown. And let's not forget that there are 1 million Chinese citizens here in South Korea who would stand to risk getting injured or even killed if a war kicks off. So nobody's interested in starting off or encouraging a war in Korea right now. I'm not making any plans to leave here, and I don't know anybody else who is.
Right, hopefully you're right. Anthony, what diplomatic events do you foresee amid North Korea's weapons ambitions and Japan's now release of radioactive wastewater from its damaged Fukushima nuclear power plant, all against, of course, the backdrop of Russia's ongoing war over in Ukraine?
Well, as far as North Korea is concerned, I hear a lot from experts that North Korea probably feels it has very little incentive to get engaged in any sort of diplomatic activity with the U.S. and South Korea until it finishes its 5-year plan to build up its nuclear and missile arsenal. Perhaps then it'll start looking for an off-ramp, a diplomatic off-ramp. On Fukushima, I don't see a lot of evidence that the government has another plan or will use another plan, so I assume that will just continue to be a card which Japan's critics can play against it. And on the war in Ukraine, I guess the thing to look at is whether South Korea and Japan change their policies regarding the export of arms to countries that are at war. There's motion on that, but it's very slow. Other than that, a lot of things are just going to depend, I think, on domestic politics, including the election in the U.S., the election in South Korea next year, and the political longevity of the Kishida administration in Japan. And I think primarily, something that I'm very interested in, is the durability and the viability of the ongoing but still sort of new rapprochement between the Japanese and South Korean governments.
Right, indeed. All right, well, that's all the time we have for this edition. Anthony, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts as always. And Jacco here in the studio, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Right, well, that ends our Monday edition of Issues and Insiders. Thank you for watching, and be sure to join us same time tomorrow.